In this project we're going to create a volcano in a rocky terrain. Flowing down the sides of the volcano will be glowing rivers of lava, and billowing from the cone will be a cloud of noxious fumes and gas. There will be two particle systems in this model. The first one will control the lava flowing down the sides of the volcano, and the second will control the smoke cloud billowing from the cone. The main emphasis of this lesson is looking at how we can control the behavior of particles through the use of forces. So, our first task is to create some terrain. Now, unfortunately, there isn't a procedural terrain item, so we're going to have to improvise. And we can follow the example set by the rock procedural item and stack successive layers of noise in order to create an interesting looking and rugged terrain. Let me show you what I mean. First things first, we need to create a flat plane, and that's easy enough to do. If we're going to be applying noise to this object, then we need to make it into a much more fine-grained object. So I'll select item mode so that we can see what we're doing, and let's go into Mesh Edit, Subdivide, Faceted, and that has subdivided our plane into 4, and we need to repeat that several times to get us down to a nice fine-grained grid. So Control R repeats the previous command. We'll just do that. We'll keep doing that. We'll keep doing that until we're up to, there we go, 131,072 polygons. That should be enough to be going on with. Right, so quickly, let's apply some noise. Back in the basic, tab, and we want to fall off with noise. Let's set the scale factor to 100% and select the move tool. Well, in fact, let's go into vertex mode. And now we can move the vertices with the move tool, and you can see that it's applying a noise to the move. And this will be our sort of low frequency general shape of our terrain. To make it more interesting, what we need to do is add a couple of layers of higher frequency. So let's change the noise scale to 50% and repeat the process. This will add more detailed noise. Drop the tool, then 10%, and it starts to bring it to life. It's beginning to look a lot more like a bit of terrain. Later on we can add more detail to this to make it look even more realistic, but for now I think that's quite reasonable, and we can turn that into a subdivision surface with tab or shift tab. I'll use shift tab for the Catmull subdivision surfaces because they're suitable for sculpting. And there we have it, a terrain in 2 minutes. So, having established the basic shape of our terrain, we need to add a volcano into the scene. What I'm thinking is that the camera will live down here in the valley and will look up at the imposing might and majesty of the volcano. So what we will probably want to be doing is building up this area here into the volcanic cone and create a crater at the top of the volcano. Right, so I'm going to do that using the sculpting tools, and to make it easier to see what's going on, I'm going to do the same trick as I did in the previous tutorial and add a matte cap shader. So without further ado, let's add a matte cap shader, load in the image, and that really just serves to show up the detail a bit more easily when we're editing the surface. Right, let's go into the Paint tab where we will find the sculpting tools. And I said we were going to develop this area here to bring up the volcano. So let's select the push tool with a brush and nozzle, and we really want to avoid trying to create sort of hideous overhangs and things. So what I'm going to do is change the normal mode to Y, and then any sculpting we do will be in the Y direction, so just straight up. Before I go anywhere, let's turn the noise fall off. Otherwise we will be sculpting wrinkly material. Well, we want to make it wrinkly later on, but for now let's just start by bringing up the surface that's already there. We need a bit more offset. There, now that's looking like a pretty imposing structure. Possibly a little bit too imposing. Let's flatten off the top so that we can build a cone. And push it down using the control key. That's already beginning to look like a volcano, I think. What would be nice to do is bring out a few sort of buttresses. We're not looking for photorealism here. If you want photorealism, you've come to the wrong man. Well, I don't think that's looking too shabby. We can picture ourselves nestled down in the valley, and what we're going to be doing is looking up at the scary looking volcano as lava erupts from the cone and flows down in the valleys here. And then we'd better run away before we get burnt to a crisp. So the thing that's going to make this look a bit more realistic is to add a bit of detail. So let's turn multi-resolution sculpting on, and at level 2 we've got about 2 million polygons to deal with, and well, things are behaving reasonably responsively. We use the push tool again to add detail, but this time we want to add detail in the average normal direction, so it's perpendicular to the surface, and we will use a noise brush. What kind of noise do we want? Well, I think probably cellular is good enough, or we could just have plain noise. Let's stick with cellular. It's what I've used previously when I've been trying this out. Now we want to just probably adjust the offset down so that we can just add in a bit of surface detail. And this will just make it more interesting to look at. And the final levels of detail we can add with suitable shaders. And there's no point in you watching me do this, so let's pause the video. So how are we going to make the lava flow down the volcano in the direction that we want it to, rather than just going all over the place? Well, we could use the dynamic system and have the particles come out of the volcano and just dynamically interact with the terrain. But this is a very complicated piece of geometry, which will make the calculations quite slow. Moreover, we don't have very much control over where the lava flow ends up going. So what I'm going to plump for instead is to use the particle system curve force. And this effectively allows particles to be steered with curves, as you might imagine. So we need to lay down some curves in the directions that we would like our lava to flow. So I've created a layer and called it lava curves. So now we need to create some curves. And we want the curves to hug the surface of the terrain. So first let's select the curve tool. And because we want it constrained to this surface, let's turn on a mesh constraint. We'll constrain it to the background mesh, that's the Volcano. We'll turn it on and use a vector constraint. And now when we create our curve, it should automatically hug this surface of this terrain. And where do we want the lava to go? Well, that looks like a promising little valley. We'll have some lava action down there. Let's create another curve for some more lava. And this time we can have it coming down in this direction, down towards where our camera is likely to be. And maybe one more. And we can always add more curves later on if we feel the urge. And miraculously those curves have wrapped themselves onto the surface because of our geometry constraint. Right, let's create an eruption. So the eagle-eyed among you will notice that I've added some extra curves into this scene just to help broaden out the lava flows. But how are we going to create these lava flows? Well, it's going to be a particle system, we know that. So we need emitters and we need forces to direct the particles around. So let's start with the emitters. I'm going to use a different kind of emitter this time. I'm going to use a source emitter, which essentially emits from vertices or from particles. So we need to create a layer to put those in. So let's add a new mesh layer, and I will call this lava emitters. And we want these particles to start at the beginning of the curves. So let's go into the curves layer. I'll hide the volcano to make it more obvious what's going on. And what we can do is just select the vertices at the beginning of all the curves, cut them with Ctrl+C, and then paste them into lava emitters. If you want to see them, we can go into Options, Active Meshes, and Show Vertices. At the moment I've got inactive meshes behaving the same as active meshes, so let's turn that off. So we can just see the vertices at the beginning of the curves. Let's put that back the way it was. I don't really want to see vertices normally. Okay, that's that job done. We'll drag those into our scene, and now we need a source emitter. Modo has helpfully connected it up with lava emitters because they were selected, and it's also kindly created us our particle system. So now we should end up with particles. I'm going to break with tradition and I'll make my particles red this time because it's glowing red hot lava. And if we run the simulation, we get particles in each and every direction. Okay, well, we don't want them flying all over the place, but let's not get too worried about that for now. The next thing we need to do is direct these particles along the curves. And we can do that by applying this force called a curve force. What the curve force does is it encourages particles to travel parallel to these curves. If we run the simulation, well, they're all flying off every which way still. That's because they start off with much too much velocity, so let's reduce that down to something a bit more manageable in this scene. I'm going to go with 30 millimeters per second and 100 micrometers per second for a bit of variation. As you can see, this is a very small volcano. You can model it in real coordinates if you want, but I didn't bother. So the particles now won't be emitted with such velocity or such vigor from the emitters, and hopefully they will now follow the curves. And of course they don't. So what have I done wrong this time? Okay, the curve force doesn't actually know which curves we're talking about. Do, do, do. Let's tell it which curves to follow. Then we might have a bit more success. Huzzah! The particles are now following our curves nicely. We've got quite a lot of particles there, and since we're probably going to be rendering these using a blob or something of that sort, we don't want to be overburdened with particles. So let's stop the simulation and reduce the number of particles we've got to something possibly a bit more manageable, and let's see how that's looking. I think that's not looking too shabby at all. Right, we need some way of seeing those particles in our renders, so let's add an item, and I'll try a blob item. Now the blob comes in at 500 millimeters, which is almost as big as our entire landscape, so I'm going to reduce that down to 13. And let's cache this simulation and see what we've got. Again, stupid Steve hasn't connected in the blob, so we don't know that we're rendering the blob. And if we do an F8 render, we can see lava bubbling out of the cone. It's a bit of an unfortunate white colour. Everything is the same material at the moment. So let's give the blob its own material. Create an item mask in the shading tree, especially for the blobs. And for now, I'm just going to make it into diffuse red material, just to differentiate it from the mountain itself. Lava isn't really very specular, so let's get rid of the specular properties. Not that it's diffuse either, but it just doesn't look right to have shiny lava. So there we have lava flowing down a mountainside. So I want to make a few minor tweaks to this model. First of all, let's increase the time that we're viewing to 480 to match the length of the simulation, and let's cache the simulation for the full 480. OK, and I'll skip forward to the end of the simulation. Let's review how it's looking. Okay, that's not looking too shabby. There's a few stragglers, you probably noticed, pinging off. We can use a terminator to kill particles that we don't like the look of. This is the point at which I'm supposed to say, I'll be back, or hasta la vista, baby. But I'm not going to. Okay, so how does a terminator work? Well, let's add a terminator into the scene. There we have one terminator. The terminator destroys particles when they fall within a certain shape, and that shape is determined by, you've probably guessed it, a fall-off. Let's add a fall-off into the scene. I'm going to use a radial fall-off, might as well. With the fall-off connected to the terminator. So we need to arrange for our fall-off to be sort of nestled in the cone of the volcano in order to eliminate the particles that get out of control, the unruly particles. So let's move the if I take a front view, this will probably be easier. Let's move the fall off to the cone of the volcano, more or less. And obviously it's much too big. So let's reduce the size and reposition. So let's give that a go and see what it does. Let's scrub through the timeline. But those unruly particles, they're not getting killed quick enough. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, the particles do get killed off if we have a look, but they don't get killed off until they get about sort of halfway to the center of the fall off. If you can imagine the fall off is essentially a field in space, and it has a value of 1 at the center and 0 at the periphery. When we get to about value a half here, this is when the particles will flip from being preserved to being killed. Well, we don't want that. We want them to be killed right at the edge of this fall off. I guess we could make this fall off bigger, but the easier way around is just to increase the solid core to 100%, and now this field has a value of 1 all the way inside of this sphere. So if we re-simulate and again scrub through, the stragglers are now being killed off. There, they try to get away with it, but then they're gone. So that's our lava. Let's do a bit of obligatory tidying up. I'd quite like to put all of this into a lava workspace, so we'll create one of those. Work lava. And let's move those into the lava workspace so we've got a nice clean fresh workspace for our next stage. While we're at it, we might as well add these items into their own group, and since we've just selected them to put them in the workspace, we can just do Ctrl G and group them, and we can rename that group lava. Right, so volcanoes, they don't just emit lava, they also produce vast quantities of smoke and steam and noxious gases, sulfurous aerosols and other unpleasantries. Let's add some smoke to our volcano. To make life easier, I'm going to hide all the previous working geometry, and then we can just work with the new stuff. And we need something to emit the smoke, so I'm going to create a new item and call this smoke emitter. And we need to add some geometry into that. I think probably just a simple disk will be fine. Let's add it into the scene. Center that and then move it in item mode into the center of the volcanic cone. Right, let's add that into our schematic, and let's add ourselves a new particle simulation. Add particles, simulation, particle simulation. And we can connect the smoke emitter to the particle simulation using a surface emitter. And Modo has done all the magic for us. We didn't need to do any wiring up by hand. And now when we run the simulation, we should see particles emitted from this surface. Let's make them black for smoke and run. There we go, particles. They're a bit too vigorous at the moment. Let's reduce their speed to 10 millimeters per second and the variation to say 2 millimeters per second. and rerun. That may be just a little bit too sluggish, so let's change that to 20. Yeah, I think that's more like it. Now, it's all a bit predictable at the moment and not terribly smoke-like. For one thing, I think we've got probably too many particles, so we can reduce that to say 100. And for another, they're just drifting up without any interesting motions associated with them. Well, we can add a force onto the surface. Sorry, we can add a force onto the particle simulation to try and liven things up. Let's add a vortex force. This should spin the particles around. Now, the vortex force is created at the origin by default. We want that to live in the middle of the cone, so we can parent the vortex force with the smoke emitter. And if I use control, that will parent it so it's in the right position. Now when we run the simulation, we should have spinning particles. We probably don't want quite such a strong force. We just need to mix things up a little bit. And these are the values that I finally settled on. The time has come, the walrus said, to render many things. Well, now we've got to the point where we've got to convert this into something renderable. So let's start with the easy thing, the volcano. Let's assign a material to that. I'll call it rock. And let's go into the shading tree. We don't want shiny rock, we want matte rock. And we need to give it some texture. So this isn't the main focus of the scene. I'm going to give it a fairly dark and predictable texture. I'm going to use my good old granite noise. And let's wind down the color so that it looks dark and moody. And it'll probably get darker still when we get to the final render. We can fiddle around with the scale of the texture. Yeah, I think that's looking not too smelly. Right, so the next thing that needs our attention is the lava itself. At the moment it's just being rendered as matte red material, which isn't very convincing. To associate a material with an item such as a blob, we need to create an item mask. Now we did that earlier in this project, but just to remind you, if you want to create a mask for something like a blob or a volume, you just right click on them and create item mask, and then the mask will appear in the shading tree. So let's have a look at this blob material. I'm going to wind the diffuse down quite low, maybe as low as 5%. So what's the main thing about lava? The main thing about lava is it's hot, and because it's hot, due to black body radiation, it's going to glow. So we need to give it a glow, and that you'll find in the material trans section, and we'll have 8 watts per steradian meter squared. And we don't want it to be glowing white, we want it to be glowing a reddy sort of a colour. Yeah, sort of a reddy orange colour. Okay, that's looking glowy, but it's a little bit featureless. So one thing we can do to try and bring out a bit of detail in this material is to use the incident angle to drive the luminous amount, or at least to modulate the luminous amount. So let's add in a gradient layer, set its channel to luminous amount, and we'll set it to multiply, which means that it'll scale whatever luminous amount we've already got on the material. We can now edit the gradient, and it's driven by the incidence. That means that on a scale of 0 to 100%, essentially measures the angle of incidence between us and the material. So glancing angles will be at one end of this scale, and rays that strike directly will be at the other end of the scale. So let's make a punt and try for 100% being dark. And that seems to be having the sort of effect that I was after. We zoom in a little bit. You can see that we can now see a bit more of a silhouette around this material. This is not entirely unreasonable from a physical point of view. There could be unevennesses on the surface that means that we don't see all of the glow at the edge. I'm making this up as I go along. We can wind this down, try and increase the amount of contrast. Maybe add another key in. And I think that's not looking too shabby at the moment. So, okay, that's the lava handled. Next we need to look at the smoke. So for the smoke we can turn off the lava. And let's go into the workspace where I've cunningly stored the smoke particle system. So to render the smoke we need to attach something to our particle system, and the most obvious thing for that is a volume. So let's add one into our workspace. And obviously this volume is much too big, so let's wind the size down to maybe 20 millimeters and attach it to our particle system. Now nothing is showing up because we haven't cached the simulation. So let's cache it and revisit. And there we have a column of smoke coming out of our volcano. It's not, it looks more like steam at the moment than sort of roiling smoke from a volcano. But that's not a problem. Well, it is a problem, but we know how to solve the problem. If we have a look at the volume item itself, you'll see that it has a volume shading section which controls the various aspects of the way that it's going to appear. One of the crucial settings is the density, and I'm going to set the density to 20 for this because I want it to be fairly thick and dense. I'm also going to adjust the fall off and level. Now these things you need to just fiddle around with until you get the result that you're looking for. At the moment it looks as though I've broken it completely and that everything has disappeared, and that would appear to be the case, but we're going to fix that up in a minute. So let's reduce the rendering quality to get faster renders, and I think I'll reduce the shadow quality as well because both of those things are costly and we need to be able to see the results in a finite time. Back in the shading tree we don't yet have an item mask for the volume, so let's create one now. Create item mask. We now have an item mask for our volume, and I'm going to add a material and use that to modulate the volumetric density. I'm going to use good old bozo noise. Use it to control the volumetric density. And we're going to wind the volumetric density from 40% up to 400%. And now our smoke is coming back. You can see the structure in here is down to the bozo noise. It makes it look more interesting and a bit more like smoke. So that's looking fairly convincing. Bring the lava in as well. Then one thing that strikes me about this is that we would expect this smoke to inherit some of the colour from the glowing lava. And at the moment we're not seeing that. So let's fake it up. If we go back to the volume item, we can add a gradient and drive that gradient, or use that gradient to drive the volumetric scattering colour. This is eventually the colour that we're going to see scattered back from this material. And we're going to use the particle age to drive the gradient. So particle effects, particle age, edit the gradient. So early on we want, because it's close to the magma lake in here, we want the early colours to be quite orange and red. And then as the particles age and they go away from the magma, we can tend towards white again. So the smoke now is red near the magma lake and then fades to normal smoky colour the further it gets away. And so after a few final tweaks and twiddles and the addition of a moody blue sky, this is the look that I've settled on for the final render. All we have to do now is set aside a few hours for rendering an animation, and I'll get back to you. So, sadly, that brings us to the end of this set of training videos. I hope that they have been useful in showing you the potential of the Modo particle system. It is a very powerful and flexible tool, and I have only just begun to scratch the surface here. I look forward to seeing what you come up with. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.